January 13th, 1888, southeastern Dakota Territory. The temperature had dropped to negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 35 degrees Celsius, before sunrise. Winds out of the northwest were running somewhere between 45 and 60 miles per hour. No one could measure them precisely, because no one could stand upright long enough to try. The sky had turned the color of iron. The kind of sky that old-timers recognized not as a storm coming, but as a storm already arriving, already surrounding, already deciding who would survive it. Across the frozen plains, livestock were dying, not in the dramatic way that people later described, not all at once, not with a sound that carried over the howling wind. They were dying quietly, in the dark corners of barns that were never built to hold heat, barns thrown together with green lumber and optimism by families who had arrived in the territory during kinder seasons and had not yet learned what a Dakota winter could truly become. The horses went rigid. The milk cows stopped producing, and then stopped standing. Pigs huddled into corners and pressed against each other until the weakest one simply did not get up again. And then there was one homestead, 80 acres situated along a low creek bend about 4 miles west of the small settlement of Hartwell, where the barn was warm. Not warm in the sense that a fire had been lit inside it. There was no fire in that barn. There was no brazier. No lantern left burning recklessly close to the hay. None of the desperate measures that other settlers were attempting and occasionally paying for with their lives and their buildings. The barn was warm because of something that had been built the previous October, something that the neighbors had watched with confusion and then with open amusement, something that had cost a woman named Ingrid Halvorsen 3 weeks of hard labor and most of the wooden planking she had been saving to repair her porch. She had dug a trench between her cabin and her barn, not a drainage ditch, not a root cellar. A covered passage, roughly 42 feet long, about 3 feet wide, and deep enough that a person of average height could walk through it with only a slight stoop, connecting the back door of her cabin directly to the side door of her barn. Packed earth on 3 sides. A low roof of cottonwood poles, prairie grass, and a thick layer of sod, invisible from the road, invisible from the neighboring farms. While every other homesteader on that creek bend was risking frostbite, or worse, running across open ground to check on their animals, Ingrid Halvorsen walked through her passage, fed her 11 head of livestock, broke the ice in the water trough, and returned to her cabin without ever stepping into the wind. That morning, every animal she owned was alive. The question, the one that would echo through that community for decades, the one that is still worth asking today, is simple. What did this Norwegian immigrant widow understand about cold, shelter, and survival that her neighbors had completely missed? To understand what Ingrid Halvorsen built, you have to first understand what she was building against. The winter of 1886 to 1887 had already rewritten the rules of survival on the northern Great Plains. Historians would later call it the Great Die-Up, a season so catastrophically cold and so relentlessly brutal that it effectively ended the era of open-range cattle ranching across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Estimates of cattle losses range from 50 to 90% in the hardest-hit regions. Some ranchers who had arrived wealthy in the fall of 1886 left the territory in the spring of 1887 with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Oral accounts collected by local land offices in the years that followed describe scenes that men who lived with them refused to discuss in polite company. But the Great Die-Up hit the large ranching operations the hardest. The small homesteaders, the families who had claimed their 160-acre parcels under the Homestead Act, who were growing wheat and keeping a modest number of animals and trying to build something permanent. They had a different set of problems. Their problem was not the scale of the cold. Their problem was architecture. The standard homestead barn of the Dakota Territory in the 1880s was a functional structure, but it was not an efficient one. Most were built with whatever lumber could be freighted in from the nearest railroad depot, green-cut pine or cottonwood planking, minimally dried, with gaps that opened further as it would contract it in the cold. Roofs were typically hay-covered wooden frames, adequate for rain, but offering limited resistance to sustained sub-zero temperatures. Walls averaged between 4 and 6 inches in total thickness. There was no insulation in any modern sense of the word. When the outside temperature dropped to minus 25 Fahrenheit, minus 32 degrees Celsius, and stayed there for days at a time, the inside of a standard homestead barn might be 10 or 15 degrees warmer, Better than nothing, but not enough to protect vulnerable animals like young cattle, milk cows, or hogs during an extended cold snap. The cabin was a separate problem entirely. Most homestead cabins in that period were built with the same limitations. Thin walls, leaky windows, floors that sat directly on cold ground or on minimally elevated foundations. But the cabin at least had a stove. The barn had nothing. And between the cabin and the barn, there was open ground. Sometimes 20 feet of it, sometimes 50, sometimes more, depending on how the homesteader had laid out their claim. That open ground, in a Dakota blizzard, was a killing field. Local land records from Hutchinson and Turner counties document at least 11 cases between 1880 and 1890 of settlers found dead on their own property, not far from shelter, sometimes within sight of their own doors, after becoming disoriented in whiteout conditions. The blizzard stripped away all landmarks. It made a yard feel like an open sea. Settlers tied ropes between their cabin doors and their barn doors for exactly this reason, a lifeline to follow when the world went white. But a rope was not a roof, and a rope did not stop the wind, and a rope did not keep the cold from doing its work on the man or woman holding it. Ingrid Halvorsen had watched a neighbor lose 2 fingers to frostbite during the previous winter, making a rope-guided trip to his barn in a storm that lasted 36 hours. She had watched another family lose their entire pig operation, 14 animals, when a husband fell ill during a blizzard and could not make the crossing for 3 days. She had been thinking about the problem for a long time before she started digging. There is a particular kind of danger that does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive with thunder. It builds quietly through repetition, through the accumulation of small risks taken daily, each one individually survivable until the one that is not. For the homesteaders of the Dakota frontier, the walk to the barn was that kind of danger. In summer, it was nothing. 40 feet of open ground between a cabin door and a barn door is a 12-second stroll. You did not think about it. You walked it carrying a bucket of kitchen scraps of pigs or a scoop of grain for the horses, and you were back inside before the coffee cooled. The children made the trip without being asked. The dog ran it back and forth all day. In a Dakota winter, those same 40 feet became a daily negotiation with the elements, and in a blizzard, they became something else entirely. The cold itself was one problem, but cold alone was manageable if you were dressed correctly and moving quickly. The real danger was a combination. Cold plus wind, plus the complete erasure of visual reference. A Dakota blizzard did not simply make things cold. It remade the entire physical landscape in real time. Drifts formed in minutes. Ground that had been bare and visible at noon was buried under 3 feet of hard-packed snow by 2 in the afternoon. The wind, which local accounts from that era consistently describe as screaming, as a wall, as something alive and deliberate, drove snow horizontally at velocities that made it nearly impossible to keep your eyes open. You could not see your own hand at arm's length. And in that condition, disorientation was not a failure of courage or competence. It was a physiological certainty. The inner ear cannot navigate without visual reference. The wind, arriving from multiple deflected angles around a building, convinced the body it was pointing in directions it was not. Settlers who knew their property intimately, who had walked every inch of hundreds of times, found themselves walking away from their destination with absolute confidence that they were walking toward it. Ingrid Halvorsen understood this at a level that was personal, not theoretical. Her husband, Eric, had died in the winter of 1884. Not in a blizzard, but from pneumonia he developed after being caught in a 2-day cold storm without adequate shelter while repairing a fence line at the far end of their property. He was 34 years old. He left Ingrid with 2 children, 11 animals, 80 acres, and a homestead that still had for years remaining on its Homestead Act proving period before it could be formally deeded. If she abandoned the claim, she lost everything. If she could not maintain the animals through the winter, she could not maintain the claim. She was 41 years old. She was 5 feet and 3 inches tall, and she had been doing the math on that walk to the barn, on every variable of risk it contained, for 3 winters before she finally decided to eliminate it. The walk to the barn, she reasoned, was not a fact of frontier life. It was an engineering failure, a problem that someone had simply not bothered to solve. either because they did not believe it could be solved, or because they had accepted it as a natural condition of homestead living without ever questioning whether it had to be. Ingrid had grown up in the Gudbrandsdal Valley of central Norway, where her family had kept livestock through winters that were, if anything, colder than the Dakota plains. And in Norway, in the old farmsteads that had been standing for generations, there was an architecture that addressed exactly this problem. It was not a new idea. It was not an invention. It was the accumulated wisdom of people who had been building in severe cold for centuries and had been left behind, along with much else. When the immigrants crossed the Atlantic and tried to rebuild their lives on an alien landscape with American lumber and American methods and American assumptions about how a farm should be arranged. She had watched those assumptions fail her neighbors for 3 years. She had come very close to letting them fail her, too. She was done with that. The idea came to her in late February of 1887, during a cold snap that kept the temperature below minus 15 Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, for 11 consecutive days. She had noticed, because she was a careful observer, and because careful observation was one of the few advantages a woman farming alone had over the problems that constantly surrounded her, that the space between her cabin and her barn had a peculiar characteristic. When the wind came from the northwest, which it did most of the time in winter, the two buildings created a kind of pocket between them. The cabin blocked the direct force of the wind. The barn, 43 feet away, caught what came around the sides. But in the zone directly between them, especially close to the ground, the air moved differently, more slowly. In certain wind conditions, she noticed, the snow did not accumulate evenly between the buildings. It piled on the leeward side of the cabin and the windward side of the barn, but in the middle stretch, it sometimes stayed relatively thin, almost clear by the eddying air currents. She had also noticed something about the snow itself. After a blizzard, when she dug out the path between her cabin door and her barn door, a task that could take an hour or more, she found that the snow at ground level was warmer than the snow at surface level. Not much warmer, but measurably warmer. The earth beneath the snow retained heat far better than the open air. Dig down 18 inches into a snowdrift, and the temperature at that depth might be only 10 or 15 degrees below freezing, even when the surface air is 30 or 40 degrees below. The snow itself was acting as insulation. The ground was acting as a heat reservoir. She had also spent time, over 3 winters, watching how her barn's temperature behaved. The 11 animals she kept, 2 draft horses for milk cows, 3 hogs, and 2 goats, generated a significant amount of body heat. A healthy dairy cow at rest produces roughly 2,000 BTUs per hour of metabolic heat. 4 cows together, in a reasonably tight space, could raise the interior temperature of a small barn by 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 9 to minus 7 degrees Celsius, above the outside air temperature, even without any additional heating source. Her barn, on a still night at minus 10 Fahrenheit, minus 23 degrees Celsius, might be as warm as 5 to 10 degrees above zero, minus 15 to minus 12 degrees Celsius. Inside, cold enough to be dangerous for the most vulnerable animals, but far warmer than the outside air. What Ingrid understood, what she began to articulate to herself during those 11 days of sustained cold in February 1887, was that these 3 observations added up to something. The sheltered zone between the buildings, the warmth retained by the earth at shallow depth, the metabolic heat of the animals in the barn. None of these were secrets. None of them required special knowledge to perceive, but she had connected them into a system that none of her neighbors seemed to have considered. If you put those 3 elements together, if you use the sheltered zone, and you use the earth's thermal retention, and you capture some of the barn's warmth rather than letting it vent into the open air, you could create a passage between the cabin and the barn that was not just a wind-blocked path. You could create a passage that was genuinely, practically warm. Warm enough to walk through without full winter gear. Warm enough to protect a person from disorientation and frostbite. Warm enough, perhaps, to serve as a modest buffer that helped retain heat in both the cabin and the barn at their connected ends. She spent the rest of February and all of March thinking through the specific mechanics of how to build it. She did not write it down, or if she did, those notes have not survived. What survives is the structure itself, or rather, the description of it recorded in a letter written by her daughter, Marta, to a cousin in Minnesota in the spring of 1888, which was later preserved in a private family collection and cited by a regional historical society in Hutchinson County in a 1947 survey of pioneer homestead structures. The design, as Marta described it, was simple, deliberately simple. Ingrid had no engineering training. She had no formal architectural knowledge. What she had was a memory of Norway, a clear-eyed understanding of the physics she had observed, and 40 years of experience solving problems with whatever materials were at hand. She would dig a trench. She would line the bottom with flat fieldstone. She would frame low walls with split cottonwood logs, stacked and chinked with clay and dry grass. She would roof it with a layer of poles, then a layer of woven grass matting, then a layer of sod at least 14 inches thick, the same sod that had been used to build the walls of thousands of homestead houses across the territory, the same material that prairie settlers had discovered, often with surprise, to be one of the finest natural insulators available in a treeless landscape. The passage would sit approximately 20 inches below grade at its deepest point, below the frost line's most aggressive reach, deep enough that the surrounding earth would act as a continuous thermal buffer. It would be wide enough for one person to walk through without turning sideways, and just high enough to avoid a full crouch. A door at the cabin end, a door at the barn end. Both doors fitted tightly. With leather gaskets she would cut herself to stop drafts. It would not be warm like a heated room. It would be warm like the earth is warm in winter, steady, quiet, resistant to extremes. It will hold a temperature somewhere between 25 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit, -4 to +3 degrees Celsius, even when the outside air dropped to -30, -34 degrees Celsius. That was not comfortable, but it was survivable. It was walkable. It was safe. She started planning the excavation for October, before the ground froze hard. She did not ask anyone's permission. She did not ask for help. She picked up her spade on the 2nd of October, 1887, and she started digging. The 2nd of October, 1887, was a clear day, cold enough to see your breath, but not yet the kind of cold that made your lungs ache. The sky was a flat, pale blue that offered no warmth, and the grass on the prairie had gone the color of old straw. The creek at the edge of Ingrid Halvorson's property had started running slow the week before. The first skim of ice appeared at its edges in the mornings and melted by noon, but not by much and not for much longer. She had chosen the date deliberately. The ground in southeastern Dakota Territory typically began to freeze hard, truly hard, down to the first several inches of topsoil, sometime between late October and mid-November, depending on the year. Once that happened, digging became a different kind of labor entirely. Slow, punishing, and in places nearly impossible without a pickaxe and a great deal of time. She had neither to spare. She had already marked the line of the trench with stakes driven into the ground the week before, a straight run of 42 feet from the back corner of her cabin, angled slightly to reach the east-facing side door of the barn, which was the door closest to the cabin and the one she used most often in winter. The width of the stakes was 34 inches, wide enough to pass through carrying a bucket in each hand, which she had calculated was the minimum practical dimension for the work she needed to do inside it. The depth was a critical variable. She needed to go down at least 20 inches below grade at the center of the trench, deep enough to reach earth that held a more stable temperature through the winter, earth that had not been touched by the hardest freezes of previous years. She had probed the soil along the line of the passage in late September, driving an iron rod into the ground at intervals to feel the resistance of each layer. At 12 inches, the soil was already noticeably denser. At 18 inches, it changed character, darker, more compressed, slower to yield. That was the layer she wanted her floor to sit on. She dug for 3 weeks. There is no gentle way to describe what 3 weeks of hand-digging a 42-foot trench looks like in the body of a 41-year-old woman working alone. Her daughter, Marta, who was 14 at the time, helped when she was not needed for other tasks, hauling the excavated earth away from the trench line in a wooden wheelbarrow, fetching water, holding boards in place while her mother drove wooden pegs to brace them. Her son, Henrik, who was 11, took over more of the animal feeding and the wood splitting, so that Ingrid could spend the maximum number of daylight hours in the trench. The excavated earth was piled along the north side of the passage line, where it would later be packed over the roof as additional insulation. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was hauled away. The floor of the completed trench was lined with flat fieldstone, gray limestone pieces that Ingrid had been collecting from the creek bank over the course of 2 summers, hauling them to the homestead on the wagon and loads whenever she had the opportunity. She had not known, when she started collecting them, exactly what she would use them for. She had known only that flat stone was useful, and that collecting it cost nothing but time and effort, which were the 2 currencies she had in the most reliable supply. The limestone floor served 2 purposes. First, it provided a stable, non-muddy walking surface that would not turn to mire in the spring thaw or collect standing water after a heavy rain. Second, and more importantly for her thermal design, stone holds heat. Limestone has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 35 BTUs per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. A floor of fieldstone slabs averaging 3 inches thick and covering 42 square feet of passage floor represents a meaningful thermal mass, not enormous, but real. During the day, as the passage was used and as the relatively warmer air from the barn and drifted to the corridor, the stone floor would absorb that warmth. At night, as temperatures dropped, the stone would release it slowly, maintaining the passage temperature several degrees above what bare earth alone would achieve. The walls were split cottonwood logs, halved lengthwise, flat face turned inward, stacked horizontally to a height of about 30 inches above the trench floor. The gaps between the log sections were packed with a mixture of clay, dry grass, and wood ash, a chinking technique that was standard practice for cabin construction in the territory, and that Ingrid had used before on repairs to her own cabin walls. The ash in the mixture served as a mild desiccant, helping to keep the chinking from retaining moisture that might freeze, expand, and crack the seal. Above the log walls, the roof frame was laid. Cottonwood poles approximately 4 inches in diameter, spanning the 34-inch width of the passage at intervals of about 18 inches. Over the poles went a layer of woven grass matting, the same coarse prairie grass that settlers used to stuff mattress ticking, and over that, sod blocks cut from the unbroken prairie surface. The sod was laid in 2 layers, offset like brick courses, with the grass side facing down on the first layer and up on the second. Total sod thickness across the roof, approximately 14 inches. 14 inches of sod is not an impressive number until you understand what it means thermally. Dry prairie sod has an insulating value roughly equivalent to 4 to 5 inches of modern fiberglass bed insulation. Not exceptional, but real. More importantly, sod's density gives it significant thermal mass. It is slow to heat and slow to cool. A 14-inch sod roof does not simply resist cold. It absorbs temperature fluctuations and moderates them. It takes a long time for outside cold to work its way through. And during that long transit time, the air inside the passage benefits from the lag. It stays warmer than the outside air for hours longer than it would under a thin roof. At the cabin end of the passage, Ingrid fitted a low door, 30 inches wide, 54 inches tall, built from salvaged planking, and hung on leather hinges she had cut from a worn-out harness strap. The door frame was set into the cabin's existing backwall log structure, carefully chinked around its perimeter to eliminate drafts. At the barn end, a matching door of the same dimensions opened into the barn sidewall. Both doors were fitted with simple wooden latch bars. Both had leather gaskets, strips of thick harness leather nailed along the interface of the door frame, that the door pressed against when closed, compressing slightly to create a seal against air infiltration. She finished the passage on October 23, 1887. She walked through it that evening, alone, carrying a candle. The flame barely flickered. The walls were close on either side. The sod roof sat low overhead. The smell was earth and dry grass, and the faint mineral tang of the limestone floor. It was not warm, not yet, with no winter to test it against. But it was still, remarkably, almost uncannily still. She stood at the barn end, her hand on the latch, and listened to the wind moving over the sod above her head. It sounded very far away. Before we reveal whether this strange passage held up against the worst winter in Dakota Territory history, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We have more forgotten frontier engineering stories coming, and you don't want to miss them. Word of what Ingrid Halvorsen was building traveled the way most things traveled in a frontier settlement. Slowly at first, then all at once, carried by the small social exchanges of community that had very little to talk about beyond the weather and the work and the occasional piece of news from town. It was Marta who inadvertently started it. She mentioned the trench project to the daughter of the Bergstrom family, Norwegians like themselves, with a claim about a mile and a half north along the creek, while they were waiting together outside the schoolhouse in early October. She described it without drama, simply as the thing her mother was currently building. The Bergstrom girl mentioned it to her father that evening. Her father mentioned it to two other men at the general merchandise store in Hartwell the following Saturday. By the third week of October, when Ingrid was in the final stages of laying the sod roof, she had become a minor subject of local conversation, and not an admiring one. The most vocal skeptic was a man named Caspar Weidemann, a German-born carpenter who had come to the territory in 1883 and who had built or helped build more homestead barns and cabins in the surrounding area than any other individual within a 10-mile radius. He was a competent builder by the standards of the time and place, and he was confident in his competence in the way that competent people sometimes are, with an authority that did not naturally accommodate the possibility that someone outside his field might see something he had missed. Weidemann's objections were practical, specific, and delivered with the patient tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone who should have known better. The sod roof would collapse under a heavy snow load. He had seen sod roofs fail before, on dugout houses, on root cellars, on outbuildings, when wet, heavy spring snow accumulated faster than it could shed. A 14-inch sod layer was already at the upper limit of what the cottonwood pole frame could safely support, in his estimation, and if the poles were not perfectly sound and green-cut cottonwood, he noted, had a tendency to check and weaken in its first winter, the whole thing would come down under the first significant accumulation. And if it came down while someone was inside the passage, the consequences would be severe. A second objection came from Olaf Strand, who farmed the claim immediately east of Ingrid's, and who had more direct experience than most of his neighbors with the behavior of frozen ground. Strand pointed out that any structure partially embedded in the earth was vulnerable to frost heave, the tendency of saturated soil as it freezes to expand and shift the materials embedded within it. He had seen stone foundation walls cracked by frost heave. He had seen root cellar linings buckle and shear. A passage built the way Ingrid was building it, he argued, might find its carefully fitted floor stones lifted and displaced by spring, its log walls torqued out of alignment, its door frames racked so badly the doors could no longer be opened or closed. A third concern was more social than structural. Oscar Feld, who ran the general store in Hartwell and who had a habit of framing his opinions as practical wisdom, suggested, not unkindly, he insisted, that a widow with 2 children and 11 animals and 80 acres to manage had better uses for 3 weeks of her time in October than digging underground passages between buildings. The animals needed feed stockpiled. The cabin needed its window gaps rechinked. There were a dozen tasks more pressing and more certain in their outcomes than an untested experiment in subterranean architecture. "She's burying her autumn," he reportedly told a customer, using the phrase in the way frontier people use it, to describe effort spent on something that would not pay back. These objections reached Ingrid through Marta, who reported them with the precise and slightly wounded accuracy of a 14-year-old who had heard people speak dismissively of her mother's work. Ingrid listened to each of them in full. She did not respond with anger. She considered the structural concerns seriously, because they were serious. Weidemann's point about snow load and Strand's point about frost heave were not foolish, and she knew it. On the snow load question, she had already made a calculated decision. The cottonwood poles she had used for the roof frame had been cut and allowed to dry for most of the summer, not green cut, which reduced but did not eliminate Weidemann's concern. She had also spaced them at 18 inches rather than the wider spacing common in outbuildings, which increased the redundancy of the frame. If one pole checked and weakened, the adjacent poles would carry the load. On the frost heave question, she had addressed it at the design stage by laying the limestone floor directly on the compressed subsoil at 20 inches below grade, below the depth at which frost penetration had historically caused significant heave in that location, based on her own observation of the ground after previous winters. The log walls, sitting on the stone floor rather than driven into the soil, had some freedom of movement. They would not be rigidly fixed in a way that made them vulnerable to sheer failure. She did not explain any of this publicly. She had not been asked. She finished the passage, fitted the doors, and went on to the other work that needed doing before winter. She was aware that she might be wrong. She had weighed that possibility honestly against the cost of being right, and had decided that the cost of not trying, measuring the risk she carried every winter on that 42-foot walk to the barn, was higher than the cost of the experiment failing. She pulled her barn door shut against the October wind and went inside to start supper. The winter would settle the argument. The storm that history would come to call the school children's blizzard, named for the terrible number of children caught in the open when it struck without adequate warning on the afternoon of January 12, 1888, did not behave the way Dakota blizzards usually behaved. Most severe winter storms on the northern plains announced themselves. There were signs: a particular quality of light in the western sky, a shift in the wind direction from south to northwest, a drop in barometric pressure that the older settlers had learned to read in their bodies as much as in any instrument. Animals grew restless. The temperature fell in a way that felt purposeful. The school children's blizzard gave almost none of these warnings. The morning of January 12th had been, by the standards of Dakota winter, almost pleasant. Temperatures across much of the territory were above freezing. Some areas reported readings in the mid-30s Fahrenheit, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, and the sky was relatively clear. Schools that had been closed for days by previous cold snaps were open. Children who had been kept inside walked to their schoolhouses. Farmers who had been housebound attempted outdoor work. It felt like a temporary reprieve, the kind of false softening that a long winter sometimes offered before tightening again. The storm arrived from the northwest with almost no transition period. Within 15 minutes of its leading edge reaching a given location, temperatures dropped 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 to 17 degrees Celsius. Within 30 minutes, visibility in many areas fell to near zero. Winds accelerated to between 40 and 60 miles per hour, with gusts higher. The storm carried fine, dry, granular snow, the kind that penetrates every gap, every fold of clothing, every poorly fitted window frame, rather than a heavy wet snow that falls in milder conditions. This snow did not pile up gently. It drove horizontally, with a force that stung exposed skin within seconds and accumulated in hard-packed drifts against any vertical surface within minutes. Across the territory, hundreds of people were caught in the open. Farmers ran for their barns and did not make it. Children leaving school were lost within sight of the building. People froze to death yards from their own doors. The official death toll from the storm was estimated at 235 in the Dakotas and Nebraska alone, though local oral accounts and land records from the period suggest the true number was higher, as many deaths in remote homesteads went unreported or were attributed to other causes in the days and weeks that followed. On the creek bend 4 miles west of Hartwell, the storm reached Ingrid Halvorson's homestead at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. She had been in the barn when the light changed, a sudden darkening, as if a lamp had been turned down, followed immediately by the sound of the wind shifting from a steady hiss to a sustained roar. She knew the sound. She had heard it before. She did not go outside to look at the sky. She closed the barn's main doors, checked that the animals had adequate water in the trough. She had been keeping it broken of ice twice daily, and walked through the passage back to the cabin. The passage, at that moment, registered an interior temperature that she later described to Marta as feeling like a root cellar in early November. Based on comparable conditions and the thermal properties of construction, a reasonable estimate would be somewhere between 22 and 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -6 to -2 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to see her breath clearly, but a full 35 to 40 degrees warmer than the outside air, which had already dropped to between -10 and -15 Fahrenheit, -23 to -26 degrees Celsius, and was still falling. She was through the passage in under 90 seconds. She did not need a rope. She did not need to keep one hand on a wall to maintain direction. She walked upright, with a slight stoop to clear the low roof, carrying a small lantern in one hand and an empty bucket in the other, and she arrived at the cabin door without incident. The storm lasted 18 hours. During those 18 hours, Ingrid made 4 trips through the passage to the barn, once in the late afternoon to feed the animals, once in the evening to break the ice in the water trough, and check that the horses were not showing signs of colic from the sudden cold, once at approximately midnight when the roar of the wind increased to a pitch that made her want to check the structural integrity of the barn roof, and once in the early morning hours to feed again before daylight. She was in the barn on that midnight check when she heard a sound from somewhere on the far side of the barn's main wall, a sound that she could not identify over the wind, and that she did not investigate further, because going outside was not a rational option. In the morning, when the storm had diminished enough to allow visibility, she found the explanation. Olaf Strand's largest hog shelter, a low-walled structure about 40 feet north of her property line, had partially collapsed under the accumulated snow load and the force of the wind. 3 of his 4 hogs had died. Strand himself had not been able to reach the shelter during the storm. He had made one attempt in the early evening, holding his rope, and had turned back after falling twice in the drifts. On Ingrid's side of property line, 11 animals had been fed 4 times during the 18 hours of the storm. All 11 were alive. The temperature differential between her barn's interior and the outside air, as best as she could measure it with the small thermometer she kept hanging on the barn's interior wall, was approximately 22 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius. At the peak of the storm, warmer than would be expected in a standard unheated barn of that size, partly because of the animals' collective body heat and partly because the passage, by connecting the cabin and the barn, had allowed a small but measurable amount of warmth from the cabin stove to migrate through the passage air toward the barn end. The passage itself had held its temperature within the estimated range throughout the night. The door at the barn end was cold to the touch but not frozen shut, and the door at the cabin end retained enough warmth at its interface that condensation had formed and frozen only in the upper corners, not across the seal. Caspar Weideman's predicted roof collapse did not occur. The sod roof, under approximately 22 inches of accumulated snow, roughly the weight Weideman had identified as the threshold of concern, had not failed. The cottonwood pole frame had held. Olaf Strand's predicted frost heave had not yet occurred either, though that judgment would have to wait until spring to be fully confirmed. It never was confirmed as a problem. The limestone floor, examined the following March, showed no significant displacement. The passage had done exactly what Ingrid Halvorsen had calculated it would do. It had turned the most dangerous 18 hours of the Dakota winter into something that was, by any reasonable measure, manageable. The storm broke on the morning of January 13th. By midday, the sky had cleared to the brilliant, hard, painful blue that follows a Dakota blizzard, a blue so sharp and bright against a white ground that it made your eyes ache after the gray enclosure of the storm. Ingrid walked out through her barn's main doors for the first time in 18 hours and stood in the snow looking at the landscape. The drifts were extraordinary, some of them chest-high against the north faces of buildings, sculpted by the wind into forms that were almost architectural in their precision. The passage between the cabin and barn was invisible from the outside, buried under 22 inches of drifted snow, its sod roof indistinguishable from the surrounding ground, except for a faint rectangular outline that the practiced eye could detect only if it knew where to look. She cleared the snow from the passage's outer ventilation gap, a small opening she had left in the sod roof near the barn end, fitted with a wooden plug that could be opened or closed from inside, and checked that neither door had been frozen into its frame. They had not. Both opened cleanly on their leather hinges. By afternoon, she had heard through Henrik, who had walked to the Bergstrom farm with a message, that the Strand family had lost 3 hogs and that one of their draft horses was showing signs of severe cold stress. The Feld family, whose claim was further east and more exposed, had lost all their chickens. The henhouse roof had failed in the night, and 2 of their 4 sheep. Further along the creek, a family named Dvorak, recent arrivals from Bohemia who had built only a temporary shelter for their livestock in the expectation of constructing a proper barn in the spring, had lost everything. 9 animals, including the 2 oxen they depended on for fieldwork. Caspar Weideman came to Ingrid's homestead 2 days after the storm. He did not come to apologize. That was not his manner, and she had not expected it. He came to look at the passage. He walked through it twice, once in each direction, stopping in the middle to examine the roof frame and the chinking of the log walls. He crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the limestone floor. He checked the door frames and the leather gasket seals. He said very little. When he emerged from the cabin end, he stood in the snow for a moment, looking at the faint rectangular outline of the covered passage, and then he nodded once, a small, deliberate nod, the kind that cost something to give. The poles held, he said. It was not quite a concession. It was not Quite a compliment. It was an acknowledgment of a fact, delivered by a man who had believed the fact would be otherwise. Ingrid told him she had dried the poles before using them. He nodded again. He asked about the chinking mixture. She described it. He asked about the sod layer thickness and the coarse offset pattern. She showed him the section near the barn end where the sod was visible from below in a small area she had left unplastered for inspection. He looked at it for a long time. He built his own passage the following October, connecting his house to his woodshed. It was 60% longer than Ingrid's 68 feet, and he modified the roof frame design, using heavier poles and a steeper cross brace at the midpoint, which he said improved its resistance to asymmetric snow load. He also widened the passage to 40 inches, which he found more comfortable for moving firewood through in arm loads. He showed it to 3 other men in the area before winter set in. By the autumn of 1889, according to a survey note made by a land agent who traveled to the Hartwell area that year and recorded it in a brief observation appended to a routine property assessment, at least 6 homesteads in the surrounding area had built covered passages of varying designs connecting their primary residential structure to an outbuilding. The land agent noted the structures with mild curiosity, describing them as a local adaptation of apparent Norwegian origin, intended to permit safe transit between dwelling and barn in severe weather conditions. He did not name Ingrid Halvorsen. Land agents of the period rarely named women in their survey notes. But the description of the first such passage on the creek bend, its dimensions, its materials, its location on a claim held by a widow with 2 children, matches no other property in the records of that area. She lived on that homestead until 1903, when she transferred the deed to Henrik, by then 27 and married, and moved to live with Marta's family in Aberdeen. The passage was still in use at the time of the transfer. A photograph taken at the homestead sometime around 1901, a stiff, slightly overexposed image of the cabin and barn in summer, preserved in the same family collection as Marta's 1888 letter, shows a faint depression of the passage line running between the 2 buildings, the sod surface grown over with grass, and nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding yard. You would not know it was there unless someone told you, which is in some ways the most fitting possible description of how the best frontier engineering worked. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was simply a problem, clearly understood, met with the materials at hand and the physics of the real world, and solved in a way that lasted, not for one winter, not for one storm. For 16 years of Dakota winters, through blizzards and cold snaps and spring thaws and the grinding repetition of frontier life, the passage Ingrid Halvorsen dug with spade and her children's help held together and did what she had designed it to do. The neighbors who laughed at her in October of 1887 were not bad people. They were people working within the assumptions of their time and place, assumptions about how a farm should be laid out and how a winter should be endured, assumptions that had calcified into habit and habit into necessity, until necessity itself felt like the only possible reality. What Ingrid understood, what the best frontier engineers always understood, whether they had been born in Norway or Bohemia or Virginia or the Scottish Highlands, was that the assumptions were not facts, that the 42 feet between a cabin door and a barn door was not a fixed condition of winter survival, that the cold was not a force to be accepted but a force to be managed, one layer of sod and one fitted door and one flat stone floor at a time. She did not discover anything new. The covered passage between a dwelling and a barn was old in Norway before anyone in her family had thought about emigrating. It was old in part of Iceland, in the farm architecture of the high Scottish islands, in the vernacular building traditions of any people who had lived long enough in serious cold to understand that the distance between warmth and its absence was not measured in feet. It was measured in decisions. She brought the decision with her. She dug it into the ground. She roofed it with the same prairie sod that everyone else was using to build walls and cover dugouts, and she found a use for it that no one in that community had thought to try. The animals survived. The winters passed. The trench she left behind grew over with grass in the summers and filled with warmth in the winters and held, season after season, in the patient, quiet, reliable way that things built from earth and stone and honest calculation tend to hold. This has been a story about one woman and one passage and one winter on the Dakota frontier. But it is also a story about something older than the frontier, something that predates every building technique described in these 8 chapters by centuries. The idea that the best solutions to hard problems are usually not complicated. They are usually just clearly seen. If this story made you think about the engineering wisdom that the frontier generation carried and the modern world has largely forgotten, if it made you want to know more about the vernacular architecture of survival, about the root cellars and the corner stoves and the sod walls and the smoke-preserved meat and all the other technologies of endurance that kept people alive before the age of centralized heat and insulated fiberglass and thermostat control barns, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what piece of forgotten frontier knowledge you'd most want to see explored next. We'll be here. And we have more stories where this one came from. Educational disclaimer. This video features frontier-inspired narratives created for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, personal stories, names, and specific situations portrayed are fictional reconstructions. However, many of the building methods, survival concepts, and practical ideas discussed are inspired by real historical techniques, traditional practices, and basic physical principles used in past frontier environments. Any modern use of these ideas should be carefully evaluated according to current safety standards, building codes, regulations, and professional guidance. This content is intended for educational and historical interest only and should not be considered professional, technical, or legal advice.